So now that we've talked about why we're here, what we're doing, the heart, mind, the client themselves, you must be wondering, okay, we've got a class of about 16 people. How are we going to organize this? What does the timeline look like? This is a really important question, and this is particularly what this section is all about. So our class is going to be operating like an independent, external consulting team. So you might even think about our class as a boutique consulting firm. And in all consulting firms, you have people who are at the helm. And those people will be myself and Candace. We are going to be serving as the principal consultants, and typically, principal consultants are responsible for landing the work in the first place. In this case, I have a very close relationship with Youth for Understanding, a very intimate knowledge of who they are, the key leaders, what they're all about, what they want in the next few years. And Candace has a very, very good understanding of China, culture, the logistics, getting to and from, and also a really good understanding of facilitating international work. Underneath the principal consultants, you usually have a few lead team members. It's a way of organizing an approach to an organization. In this case, we're going to be looking at learning across basically 4 different levels. And those lead team members are going to be selected by teams based on their knowledge, their skills and abilities. We might do an election process, but we might see that it comes about more naturally. And those 3 lead team members are going to have their own role, and you see that they're right in between the principal consultants and the teams themselves. We'll talk more about what their role is in a little bit. And then we have the 3 teams. And to make things easier, each team is going to bite off a piece of learning that has to do with a different level of learning in an organization. So overall learning in an organization you might call organizational learning. And if you look at Team 1, we have Bethany Olson, Elena, Justin, Imran, and Molly. So you might be wondering, why in the world did we pick these particular people for Team 1, and Team 2, and Team 3 for that matter? Candace and I looked very carefully at the makeup of this class. We looked at your backgrounds, we looked at your understanding, your years of experience in the field. We looked at your ethnic background. We looked at making sure that we had an equal spread of gender across the teams, and a lot of different personality things that we understood from our work in classrooms. We basically took a lot of time in thinking about who to put on each team. And I'm sure there are a number of different ways this could have been organized, but we felt that diversifying teams was the best way to enhance learning for you. Team 2, we have focusing on team and individual learning at YFU, and you see that we have Rebecca, Erica, Charles, Sonia, Chijian, and Alicia. And Team 3, which is going to be focusing on cultural learning, has Megan, Jessica, Eric, Kelly, and Melissa. When you're working on teams, it's really crucial to understand roles. This sort of directs the behaviors, the interactions, and gives everybody a clear line of sight between one's responsibilities and who can consult the person in their responsibilities, who can inform that person, and how the overall structure is organized. So as principal consultants, our role or responsibility is to manage the relationship with the senior leadership team at YFU. And the key name there is Dana Lee, who's a woman who is the head of YFU Greater China and somebody that I've come to respect quite deeply. We have a very close working relationship. And like we mentioned earlier, it's often this relationship that actually enables or brings in work to the consulting team. Conversely, we also steer the ship. We provide overall direction for the firm's lead team. Now, following each client meeting, we also provide an after-action review to the entire class. We looked at what worked, what didn't, from our own expertise perspectives. Our responsibilities are also organized, and some of them are shared and some of them are divided, but it gives you a sense of who you can come to and talk to about specific things. You'll see that Candace is the lead logistical expert. She's going to be involved in anything from visa applications to the travel, the getting taxis, all sorts of different information, local culture, food, language and customs. She's also going to be an advisor specifically for the sub-teams, that is teams 1, 2, and 3, and an advisor for client delivery and interaction. She's also going to be a coach and mentor for everyone involved in the process. When it comes to my experience and my responsibility, I'm going to be the lead client expert, since I know a lot about the client and I have relationships that are already existing with YFU. I'm going to be the OD delivery expert, so I'm going to be there to provide you with tools, know-how, and consult you to make sure that you have what you need to do a basic consulting exchange. I'm also going to be the lead team advisor, whereas Candace is the sub-team advisor. I will be advising the 3 lead team members, specifically around client delivery and interaction. And just like Candace, I'll be a coach and mentor to all during this process. What about those lead team members? Well, the way it works is that one person from each sub-team is going to assume that role, and it's going to create a 3-person lead team. And that's going to develop a sense of cohesion across the survey that we're going to be creating, the interaction that we're going to be maintaining with the client, and the results, the unveiling of the masterpiece, if you will. So this lead team is responsible for a lot, and that's why they assume the leadership position. One is proactively reporting progress and receiving advice from Candace and myself, who are the principal consultants. Also, they'll be managing relationships with regional YFU leaders. So if you think about it, the principals, Candace and myself, will be dealing with senior leaders, whereas the lead team will be dealing with regional leaders. So we're actually covering all of the bases when it comes to the YFU leadership team. This lead team will also be responsible for coordinating a single survey and tabulating the results from that survey. And the survey, as you'll see a little bit later, will have 3 parts, all which stem from individual teams. The lead team will also be responsible for kicking off and concluding all client meetings. The first client meeting in particular will be introduced by the principals, Candace and myself. The lead team is also responsible for leading the rehearsal of client delivery, really making sure that there's a seamless sense of delivery between the sub-teams and making smooth transitions with no redundancy and equal tempo. And what about those who are on the teams? Well, if you see your name on the team and you want to assume a team member role, all of the members of the sub-team are responsible for the data collection and tabulation, which will be primarily done through survey and also some non-intrusive data collection techniques that we'll talk about later. The client facilitation, and also quality control, making sure that we go in there not only as students, but we're going in there as a professional organizational development team. There's going to be a focus on 2 areas. One is the process. Each team will have its own timekeeper, presentation organizer that looks over the PowerPoints and handouts. Each team will also have their own facilitator who organizes emails and group meetings, and a process checker. And that person is really the team lead, and somebody who really looks out and makes sure that technology is up and running and ready to go. The second is content. Each team will be responsible for one subject matter area organized into one day of client facilitation, and that breaks down into organizational learning, team and individual, and cultural learning. When it comes to processing content, we're going to spend some time in our first class making sure that we assign roles and get a really strong sense of what we're going to be focusing on individually as teams. And anyone who does this type of work for a living knows that there's always roles that can fall in between the cracks. As much planning as you do, things come up that are unexpected. So here's the deal. We've got some additional leadership roles that we'd like people to step up and take on. One is a presentation technology lead. This is a person who has very, very high understanding of technology, such as PowerPoint, video, and all of the different things that go into making sure that the technology is running smoothly before we even start our presentation. There's also the documentarian, and this would be a person who documents the entire experience through pictures and videos and stories that we'll be able to share and review when we come home for our final class. And something that really helps out with culture shock, which we're going to talk about later, is taking on an expertise in an area of the culture that you're visiting and being more of an expert in that area than most people who live there. And in doing this, it gives you something to sort of latch on to. So we'd like people to step up individually and take on an expertise in some of the places that we're going to be going to for cultural exposure. And you'll see that there's quite a variety here, and I'm sure that there's more that you don't see here, like cuisine and art. So when it comes to individual teams, if you look at Team 1, we're looking at organizational learning, and we'll talk a lot more about this in class. The focus is organizational learning, and one of the tools that we've used in the past, and I've been fortunate to learn under the mentorship of Victoria Marzik, who developed something called the Dimension of Learning Organization Questionnaire, which have a lot of great questions pertaining to learning at the organizational level, specifically around strategy. And the learning organization talks about how, you test things out. You test out new ways of learning, of doing things in a spirit of experimentation and almost a playful curiosity, and reviewing what works and what doesn't as an organization. So the tasks for Team 1 is to develop 10 questions for a survey. You might even think of this as a simple version of the Dimensions of Learning Organization Questionnaire. These questions will be determined by you, and we're going to go over in the next section how that takes place, what the strategy is for selecting your survey questions. Another task is this team is going to be responsible for analyzing the results of this survey, not only by the organization level, but by the regional level. And finally, based off of what we learn, this group is going to be responsible for planning a half-day of presentation around organizational learning. So the deliverables are to facilitate from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. on a specific date, and we'll see a timeline a little bit later on. And in this presentation, what you'll be doing is showing them the findings of this survey. And you might be surprised that members who are part of this group may not be aware of what other regions are thinking and doing. And in part, that section of the presentation is very revealing for them to begin with. Also, as part of the facilitation, we'd like to ask that you do 3 different areas of reflection. One is individual reflection, where you facilitate a part of the discussion through individual reflection, where individuals are reflecting on their own. They get a quiet time. This is particularly important for introverts. A second is a team level of reflection, and you could do that in dyads, where you have 2 or more people. Well, in a dyad example, you have 2 people, but in a team, you have 2 or more people pairing up and doing reflection together. And then finally, if you think about organizational reflection, we'd like you to facilitate a portion of the class on incorporating the ideas from individual and dyad reflection and discussing them as a whole, with everybody who is present. But it's not just about reflection. What is key here is making sure that the organization has action steps. So through these key insights that they'll be coming up with, there will be some areas for improvement, further exploration, and so you'll be facilitating that action planning process. And then finally, during the facilitation process, we'd like you to at least collect some data in real time and provide a summary report either during that presentation or on the following day. And you see that there's 2 different types of data. One is qualitative. You might look at themes of what people are coming up with during the time together, or you might look at actual scores from in-class surveys that you give. It's really up to you, and we're going to spend a lot of time putting that together. Team 2's deliverables are virtually the same, but the only thing here is that the focus is going to be on team and individual learning. We're going to be providing, just as with all other teams, a lot of information on this, and we're going to ask you to pull from your own expertise now that you've had a couple of classes in our program, in terms of the tools that you've used, the theories, the approaches, in order to develop survey questions and analyze results and develop a facilitation plan. Many times when it comes to boutique consulting, the one or two principals from the organization will present their own discussion with the group. And in this case, I will be, and I have actually been asked to facilitate a discussion around organizational and regional and global culture. So in this case, Team 3 is going to be working very closely with myself to develop these deliverables. But instead of facilitating a half day all by themselves, this team will be delivering 4 hours of facilitation within a full day of facilitation that I will be running. So there's going to need to be some careful coordination here between myself and this team, particularly in the 10-question survey that we're going to be giving YFU around organizational culture. We'll also work together to analyze results by organization and region, and we're going to plan facilitation together. Mapping the facilitation for the day will be very important, and we will not be dividing it by half days where the team facilitates for one half of the day and I facilitate for the other half. We'll be intermingling our tasks and responsibilities. So when we think about all the things that we're going to be doing, our cups are full to the brim. But really, it's quite a straightforward process. If you look at the syllabus and you look at that as a form of a timeline, it can be a little bit overwhelming because you've got an awful lot of details. And we want you to look at the syllabus as just that, sort of a one-stop shop for all of the details that are involved in this process. But if you look at the process from a more of a 20,000-foot view, you'll see that there are really some key benchmarks that we're working toward, and the process is more simple than we might be thinking. So Candace and I thought that a real easy way to put this together is to split our trip into two parts. What we're going to be doing prior to the trip and what we'll be doing during the trip. So you'll see that prior to the trip, we're going to be getting together on February 10th. The very first thing is to sit down in our teams, discuss our tasks, answer questions, and really spend some time developing the survey together. And then, of course, on 2/14, we'll be sending the survey out. And our clients have promised to receive the survey and bring it back to us by February 20th. Then by March 5th, we will be analyzing the survey. And between the 5th and the 12th, we'll be developing some simple presentation tools and dialogue topics for our clients. And then on 3/19, by that time, we should be finalizing our PowerPoints and rehearsing. It's a pretty tight schedule, but if you think about the way that it's organized, we're all biting off a tiny chunk of time, and we all are biting off a chunk of tasks. So it makes the entire project more manageable. During the trip, we're going to arrive on the 22nd or the 23rd. We have a lot of people who will be arriving early, and I will be on that plane. We'll be having lunch and dinner with YFU on the 24th. Nothing formal, just time to get to know the group before we actually sit down and do any facilitation. Then on the 25th, Team 1 is up, and they're going to be facilitating a morning session. I put DLOQ there. I should have probably put learning organization because that's really what you're going to be talking about. How is YFU a learning organization, and how can they improve at the organizational level? On 3/26, we're going to do more team-based learning and individual inquiry, and I put a couple of tools down there that you might want to use. One is a collegial inquiry tool, and the other one is called the 4 columns exercise. Of course, you can do anything that you like, but I was thinking that those tools might be appropriate depending on the answers we get back on the survey. And that's an afternoon facilitation. And then on the 27th, we have an all-day facilitation on cultural intelligence with Team 3 and myself. So between February 10th and March 12th, we're going to be collecting data, synthesizing the data, and then we're going to be presenting some tools and creating some facilitation tools for dialogue. And that's a lot. So this is really why we presented this to you as a video, so that you can get a sense of what we're doing and spend more time in class actually doing it. So it all starts with a survey. In developing the survey, we're going to have 3 parts to the survey. The first is going to deal with organizational learning, and Team 1 is going to develop those 10 questions. The second will deal with individual and team learning, and Team 2 will develop those questions. And the last will deal with culture and the impact of culture on learning, and Team 3 will develop those 10 questions. The lean team will then put it all together in a 30-question survey and send that out by SurveyMonkey, where the data can be entered in real time, accessed in China, and tabulated for easy use. Now, we could take pre-existing survey questions, for instance, from the Dimensions of Learning Organization questionnaire, and just throw those over, pick the 10 best ones that we like. But that's not really a good comprehensive way of developing a survey, specifically when our purpose is to develop insight that deals with the organizational and regional strategy of YFU. So we start with questions like, what opportunities exist to innovate organizational, team, individual, cultural learning to support YFU strategy? That's the purpose of this survey. And we're going to basically be drawing from our expertise, the literature, and the professors, Candace and myself, to develop these opportunities through tools when we sit down in the classroom. But all of this depends on a process. And the first step in the process is doing our homework and understanding who Youth for Understanding is by looking at existing data, including a report that I'll be providing on years of research that I've done with YFU pertaining to learning styles and personality styles by region. And also some information that I've gotten from about 5 different regions that deal with the most effective learning and facilitation strategies when you sit down with members of YFU. Also, in terms of existing data, you'll be able to look at websites, contact the organization chapter in Minnesota, and look at a number of different videos and pieces of information about the organization, and you'll also be able to talk with me about it. There will be some things that aren't on paper you might be curious about that I can help you learn about. The next step is asking yourself, what is YFU's organizational and regional strategy? What are they aiming to do? And then how does learning currently support that strategy? That's ultimately what it's about, that last point right there. How does learning currently support strategy? Appreciating the best of what YFU is doing right now and providing them with further dialogue so that they can produce their own insights and test new ways of looking at learning to support strategy in the future. There's an enormous amount of data that I've been collecting on YFU since about 4 or 5 years ago, and I'm going to be providing all of this to you. Some of it provides some really deep insight on organizational learning as a whole and also regional learning. And a lot of what we found surprised not only myself, but the people who are involved at YFU, my clients. So I'll be sharing all of these with you. And as you can see, there are a number of different ways to represent data. One of the important things I want you to think about is when representing data, making sure that it's done clearly and in a way that's understood specifically by the culture that you're presenting it in. In this case, when I was presenting learning styles and the different types of learning styles that were present or predominant in different regions, as you see in the upper right-hand corner, we have Shanghai, Tianjin, and Shenzhen. I used Chinese zodiac signs to represent these learning styles because these were instant symbols for our participants to latch onto, to understand the types of approaches to learning, such as the monkey and the tiger and the ram and the dragon. Each of them provided their own story, and I didn't really have to do too much unpacking. It was easily accessible, and this is something that you should also think about when presenting data. Here's another way of showing data. Now, interestingly, when you think about China and you work with people in China, you notice that when you ask a question, it's often met with silence. We might assume right away that most people in China are introverts, but actually the data that we collected in large part showed that there's an equal, if not larger amount of extroverts in China across different regions. So that has a lot of different implications, because if the culture says we need to first be quiet, or that silence is golden. But you have, in this case, more extroversion. That creates a sense of dissonance that we used actually to discuss learning opportunities and the trade-offs between culture and personality. So there's a lot of really surprising things that come up, and this is just another example of how to report data. And this is just a different way of reporting data in a larger sense. So you see that the number of participants has increased at this point, and the data rolls up. And this is very helpful, especially for people who also need to facilitate learning with these populations. At the end of the day, what you really need to do is look back at all of the data, all of the insights, all of the discussions and themes that come up in terms of how the client can empower and guide themselves into the future. And then take all of that and present it or unveil it as a sort of masterpiece. So one of the things that I like to do, and you may choose to do, and you're not required to, but is to create a sort of executive summary. An executive summary that captures all of the learning, that discusses what many of the strengths and opportunities are for learning. And one of the things that we'll be presenting you with is a dossier of information, and I will be including one of those reports, a 2011 report, in that dossier. So I was thinking about giving you an example of how this works. And one of the best examples I can give you, and is really a highly similar example, is some work I did with the U.S. Army medical research teams in Nairobi, Kenya. Just about every year, teams from throughout Africa get together in a conference space. And that's exactly what YFU is going to be doing. And when they came together in that conference space, they wanted to know more about sharing the knowledge, learning across different teams, and improving upon strategies for organizational learning. And that's why I was called in to consult. So the first thing I did was I looked at existing learning opportunities. And I just spoke with commanders and generals in the Army about what is going on currently, thinking about the types of formal and informal opportunities for learning. And we did this in sensing sessions. So really it's an informal type of conversation. And a lot comes out of that, a lot of interesting information about the culture of learning, the technology that's involved, and also the politics that come up. Next, I went to determine what the U.S. Army strategy was for the infectious disease research units. And I used the website that they have, and I used some yearly reports that I was provided by people within the organization. And I had a number of discussions with line managers and researchers about their strategy. And next, I looked at how learning was connected with strategy. One of the things that came up with this idea of best practice sharing across Africa. If somebody came up with a great idea in Ghana, how would they share that with a team in Tanzania? And another thing that was interesting that came up was questions about informal learning. This is learning that doesn't take place in a classroom. This is learning that takes place in the field. And through conversations and all of the research that I had done prior to creating the survey, I learned a lot about how most of the innovations to process occurred in the field informally. So you can imagine that questions that I'd create be focusing on some more of the informal learning areas and looking to expand upon those and appreciate what works there. So when I developed the survey, I was thinking about all of those things: strategy, structure, existing process, learning opportunities. And I asked 7 questions. I didn't use a 30-question questionnaire. I asked only 7. And here are just a few of the questions that I asked and some of my rationale for why I asked them. One was, what is your level of education? I wanted to know this for each of the participants. It seems like a very basic question, but what happened was my conversations with the commanders and the line managers and the researchers suggested that a lot of the obstacles for learning that could have already happened resulted from power differences. And I know from my background and my expertise that Power differences exist through a number of different ways, and one of them is through level of education. And they have a very big impact on learning, and hence a very big impact on success and reaching the strategic goals that are set by the organization. And I wanted to confirm whether there were differences between the perceptions of learning between those with higher and lower educational backgrounds. And it turns out that in the actual facilitation, we did determine a number of ways that exists, and we found different ways to rectify that. Second question was, what are the most difficult obstacles you experience in teams? And this was an open-ended question. You'll see some of the answers to that question on the next slide. But the data suggested that the strategy focus dealt mainly with technical challenges, how you do things that you could look up in a book or ask an expert about. But while adaptive challenges, where you can ask an expert and that the answers are not so cut and dry or black and white, while they do arise from time to time, it's not a capacity that was developed adequately for these teams. And the truth of the matter is, most of these teams had great technical knowledge. They had gone through the training, they had gone through the skills development. But in Africa, because of the rocky socioeconomic climate, there were a lot of adaptive challenges that came up, and teams had to handle them one-on-one and had to pull from their creative resources. But that capacity hadn't been developed enough. So I knew that was important, and that had to be part of the facilitation process. And lastly, the question of how often do you enter deep discussions with others? It's a very simple question, and it sometimes helps to get quantitative data. And wouldn't it be interesting to see, I thought, how much versus how little these opportunities exist? And we found out that numbers speak quite loudly in this regard. So here are some of the data that I received as a result of this survey. You can understand data as two parts, one as qualitative and the other as quantitative. So here are some qualitative themes on the left-hand side. Some of the learning challenges that these teams faced were the demands, the emotions, and the adaptive challenges, like I mentioned previously. And one of the things that came up was the challenge of turnaround time. It was very tight on tasks that were assigned on short notice. When it came to technical challenges, it was mainly around clinical demands, lab meetings, and information sharing. And we found that due to the diversity in terms of age and educational levels, it's sometimes challenging to actually hold the team together. So cohesion is extremely important rather. And so I knew that this course had to offer something, and the conversations that we'd be facilitating had to deal specifically with team cohesion and learning as a team. And finally, learning opportunities that they felt were great and needed to be expanded upon were adding a sense of variety. So not always being a one-hit wonder, but doing different types of things, expanding beyond the typical roles and boundaries that the Army sets for people. Another is cooperation. People like working together in this group. Brainstorming was also very popular, and the sense of personal, deep development. And then on the right-hand side, you see some quantitative data about the makeup of this group, which is also very helpful in the creation of our time together. So when you get all of that data, what the heck do you do with it? I mean, you've got a ton of data here, and now it's time to translate that into some sort of facilitation, some sort of dialogue, some sort of reflection that will add to the insight of the organization and maybe give them some steps forward. This section is all about translating data into dialogue. So when it came to the U.S. Army, if we think back to all of the data that I provided to you in the previous slides, how do we actually translate that data into activities? And here's a picture from that event. One exercise we felt should simulate an adaptive challenge, because this is one of the things that they needed to develop a capacity around, learning through adaptive challenges and having a sense of emergent learning, dealing with the unexpected. And what we really needed was a simulation that would be a fertile ground for reflection, for the adaptation, the emotion, and the power differences that come up when a team deals with adaptive challenges. And an insight that came from the survey is that there is an influence from power differences. For instance, people who assume different leadership roles did so for a certain reason, and we saw during the particular activity that we used that some leaders stepped up, some didn't. Some of the leadership qualities were shared across team members. And this all gave us a lot of areas for reflection and also later on action planning. And why is this so crucial to the organization's strategy? That was a deeper part of the conversation and really validated the reason why we were doing the activity in the first place, and also made it more of a call to action. And that call to action dealt with asking the question, how can we apply what we learned through this activity, this adaptive challenge, in the field? That is, through baby steps. Well, how can we actually develop this further? Who's going to be involved? Who's responsible for certain things? What types of things are we going to be testing out? And when will we be actually testing them? Really putting a due date on these sorts of activities. And then how are we going to measure success? Now, in this case, I was not telling them the who, what, and when. They were looking back on the activity that they went through, which was a simulation of an adaptive challenge. They looked back on what they reflected upon and the insights that they gained, and they developed their own action plan, things that they felt comfortable with, that they felt that they could take charge of and control of, and things that they could measure. And of course, we couldn't do this without the full support of the leaders involved. In this case, the activity that we used to simulate an adaptive challenge was the tower building exercise, which is something you may even want to use. The tower building exercise works like this. You split the group up into separate teams and you ask each team to develop the tallest tower. You give them 5 minutes to develop it and the same exact materials for each team. Within the 5 minutes, the team has to decide how and what structure would best suit the tallest tower. And of course, if you think about this, if you have different materials and different team members, there are a multitude of ways that you could develop a tower. Time management is important, process is important, leadership is important, and all of these things come into play. And when we think about managing infectious disease research in Africa, the adaptive challenges that come up are not so different. The processes are the same. The content is different, but the capacity for dealing with adaptive challenges is the same. And that's why I chose that activity. One way we'd like you to think about the work that you're doing is that planning is about 95% of the work that you're going to be doing. It's an awful lot of preparation. But when you get there, the heavy lifting is done by the people who are engaging in dialogue and working with you, whether you call it a workshop or a meeting. It's the people that are your client that will be doing most of the work. You're just providing the structure. And like I mentioned earlier, the best facilitators become almost invisible and unnoticed. And again, this goes back to the very beginning and opening of this presentation, which is the purpose of OD, which is to provide insight, to empower the client, and also to guide them toward next steps. And the process itself as it unfolds is organic, and it's a beautiful thing. So while each team is facilitating, the other two teams who are present will be observing. They'll get a chance to see the client in action and the results. No two client facilitations that I've done have ever been the same. None. Even within countries, within like India, for instance, when I do facilitation in 9 different school systems, the cultures are different, the people are different, the expectations are different. But the one thing that remains the same is the human element. It's a beautiful thing. When you give people an opportunity and create a common space, a safe space that is, for developing creative options, that's what it's all about. And everyone appreciates that. It might be hard at first when you begin facilitating, specifically in cultures that seem to not be responding right away and need really to warm up and develop a sense of trust with you. And China is one of those cultures. But it happens. And in trusting the process, you'll see that it does unfold. So we're going to ask that you do trust the process and let you know that you can anticipate a very, very good time throughout all of this. Not only is your client going to learn a lot about themselves, but hopefully you will learn a lot about yourself as well. So now that you've learned a lot about why you're here, what you're doing, who the client is, and how you're going to collect data and organize yourselves as teams, there still must be a lot of questions. Life really is about the questions. The questions in the Eastern culture are often more interesting than the answers, and so you might lead your experience with questions. And not just lead your experience with questions, but listen to yourself, listen to others. Depend on each other, because that's where transformation and change occurs. Confucius once said, "They must often change who would be constant in happiness or wisdom." Keep those words of wisdom in mind. We're really looking forward to working with you.